hosting statewide in the month of May, and I'll get into that a little bit here. So for starters, just by way of background, the Department of Public Service, our primary mission is to provide affordable, safe, secure, reliable access to a variety of services, so electric, gas, steam, telecommunications, and water service. We also have an obligation to protect the environment and New York's natural resources while doing so. So an overview of today's webinar. I'm briefly going to just set context by giving a general overview of New York's reforming the energy vision, otherwise known as REV. Then I'll touch on actually the process around the CES proposal, how it's been developed to date, and next steps. Then Tina's going to get into the staff white paper on CES that was issued in January, and she'll go through a couple of the details there. Carl Moss will then walk us through a few slides on the Clean Energy Standard cost study that was recently released. And finally, after all of the presentations, we'll go through question and answer. So just a note of housekeeping. If you do have a question, please use the chat function as part of the WebEx feature. I think that you should be able to chat on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. So just quickly, reforming the energy vision. The Clean Energy Standard is proposed as a core component of the broader strategy that Governor Cuomo initiated a few years back, titled the Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV. And really this initiative is aiming to create a cleaner, more resilient, and more affordable energy system for all New Yorkers. Another way to think about it is REV's really looking to change the way that energy is produced, delivered, and consumed. REV really places a priority on clean, locally produced power and wants to see this at the core of New York's electricity system. So this is really where the Clean Energy Standard comes into play, and its purpose to ramp up the deployment of clean energy while also aiming to address our carbon emissions. So one way to look at REV is, and what it's aiming to achieve, is to look at this following spectrum. So, first, REV is really looking to empower customers to take greater control over their energy choices and better manage their energy decisions. To do this, REV really intends to support, stimulate markets for distributed energy resources, a variety of resources up and down the spectrum. And all of this is intended to drive towards a more efficient electricity system that has lower environmental impacts and has increased affordability. So moving on to the Clean Energy Standard. In December of 2015, the Clean Energy Standard was put forth by Governor Cuomo really as a way to think about how we can address our carbon dioxide emissions and ramp up renewable energy at the same time. So these two objectives are really at the heart of the Clean Energy Standard proposal. They're obviously intimately linked, and the governor's previous commitment to these issues and the proposal put forth really makes New York a national and in many respects international leader in this space. So REV and the Clean Energy Standard are intended to work hand in hand. So while the Clean Energy Standard is driving to scale up renewable energy and clean energy with public and private investment, REV will take on the challenge of thinking about how to effectively integrate this generation within the electricity system and make sure that the value and the benefits brought by these clean energy resources are realized by all New Yorkers. So what's in the Clean Energy Standard proposal? Three main components, well, I guess two main components, and then the ultimate objective. So the first is that it converts what has been a target in the state energy plan of meeting 50% renewable energy by the year 2030. It converts that into a mandate, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from Tina later. The second proposal includes an interim transition plan to support emissions-free upstate nuclear power. So these two proposals combined will help to ensure that the state meets its aggressive goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by the year 2030 and 80% by 2050. So the CES will significantly reduce carbon emissions. That's one of the primary objectives that the proposal aims to get at. So for new renewables alone, the projections have new renewables contributing to the reduction of 15 million tons of carbon dioxide in the year 2030. So that equates to the 30% reduction in total carbon emissions from the electricity sector alone, which is on par with the state's economy-wide goal of 40% reduction by 2030. Again, with the proposal to support the continued operation of upstate nuclear facilities, this will significantly help us prevent backsliding on the progress that we've made on greenhouse gas reduction. Estimates suggest that it offers the potential to prevent an increase of 15.5 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. So how do we get there? I just want to spend a few minutes here before turning it over to Tina to go through some aspects of the staff white paper to talk a little bit about process. So as I mentioned, the governor directed the commission and staff to come up with a clean energy standard proposal. He directed that back in December of 2015. Following that, the commission expanded its large-scale renewables proceeding to encompass consideration of the CES proposal and directed staff to come up with a specific white paper proposal to consider policy options for the CES. So that white paper was issued late January. There were public comment periods put out for that, both an initial comment period and reply comment period. The initial already passed us was April 22nd, and we've got May 13th coming up quickly on reply comments. So that's the staff white paper. Other supporting documents that go along with the white paper is the environmental impact statement and the cost supplement. So the environmental impact statement comes from the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, which directs the consideration of environmental factors into planning and decision-making for government agencies at the state, regional, and local level. So that was released February 23rd. You can find it available online through the following link. The second document, which Carl's going to speak to in a little bit here, it was the cost supplement to take a look at the costs and benefits of pursuing the Clean Energy Standard proposal. So this was released March 8th. You can find the link there, and then comments are due beginning of June. Oh, April 8th, I'm sorry. So what else have we done? Between the time of the issuance of the white paper and now, we've had several engaging stakeholder workshops and technical conferences. We had one on deployment of new renewables. We had one on the nuclear aspect of the Clean Energy Standard. We have one tomorrow, actually, on the cost study. And we're also considering holding one on the interaction of energy storage technologies and the clean energy standard. So I believe the majority, if not all, of these workshops and technical conferences have been streamed online, and we have video recordings of them available through that link. So these have been a great opportunity for us to engage stakeholders in a way other than written comments and hear perspectives and positions as we do our internal deliberations. So finally, and I know Tina will touch on sort of next steps, the formal next steps as this process moves forward, but the next near-term activity that we have is a series of public statement hearings scheduled for May. So that's coming right up. They start next week and will conclude on the 31st of May. I think we've got, let's see, 12 locations, including locations on Long Island, and the next slide will get into the details there. But really, these are an opportunity, again, to run through some of the material that we're doing today, provide some information to folks, answer any questions as appropriate, and then have a formal public statement hearing where everybody who desires can get on the record with their opinions or perspectives, and that'll be encompassed in the record and considered by the Commission as they make their final deliberations. So there's a link there for more details about the schedule and what it entails to participate. This is just the quick rundown of the schedule. At each location, we will have 2 sessions, an afternoon and an evening session, to try to accommodate folks. Each public statement hearing will be preceded by an hour-long info session, very similar to what we're presenting here today in the webinar. Also an opportunity to ask clarifying questions of staff that will be there. So you'll see the rundown here. The locations that aren't listed here will be forthcoming, but those are, I think, 3 venues on Long Island in the month of May as well. So we're going to be busy in the month of May. So with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Tina Palmero, and she's going to walk us through some of the different aspects of the white paper.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was an excellent overview of REV, clean energy, and what's going on at the Public Service Commission and in New York State on all things clean energy. Before I get started, I first wanted to acknowledge that I am accompanied by 2 other members of staff, Jeff Hogan and Tom Rienzo, who were both very instrumental in the development of staff's white paper on the clean energy standard. And as Peter indicated, the white paper that was released by staff in January of this year is really a framework, a policy framework and a program framework of how we get to the goal of this 50 by 30, and that's 50% renewable energy consumed in the state by 2030. The paper lays out a number of recommendations. The primary ones are, I'm sorry, Peter, you can advance that one. The primary ones are that the obligation to achieve the goal would be on all electric utilities, all electricity suppliers, including utilities, ESCOs, both jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional entities. So the jurisdictional entities are those that would be under the regulatory purview of the Commission. The non-jurisdictional entities would be the New York Power Authority and the Long Island Power Authority. And although the Commission does not have jurisdiction over those last 2 entities, we would expect that they would contribute toward the clean energy standard in many similar ways as they have done throughout the years of the renewable portfolio standard, which has predated the CES. So the other recommendation is that staff laid out a schedule of targets through 2020 with an overall target in 2030. And the schedule took into consideration what we know today in terms of what we believe would come online in the near term of the CES, and then understanding that we would have to produce a schedule through the intervening years to get to a 2030 target. But again, the white paper does lay out annual targets through 2020. The other item that the white paper does is it takes into consideration tiers to support both new and existing renewable generation, and also how to incorporate nuclear generation facility to be able to keep them online, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the Clean Energy Standard tiers, the reason why that staff is recommending that tiers be incorporated into the design of the program is for several objectives. As you can see on the slide, we have it broken down into 3 main tiers, with tier 2 being 2 sub-tiers. So for tier 1, we want to obviously employ or deploy new renewable resources to get new resources built in the state. We also want to be able to preserve existing clean energy generation, and we don't want to see those resources, we don't want to have attrition of those resources. So in order to maintain those renewable resources, we've broken those down into 2 tiers. Tier 2A would be these legacy renewable resources that are existing now. They're primarily contracted with NYSERDA, and once those resources come off their contracts with NYSERDA, we want to be able to have an opportunity to retain those attributes and that energy in New York State. The way that the program is going to be designed, it's going to be one that's market-based. We're going to be competing with other states that have a similar program. So the thinking here is that we wanted to encourage those resources from leaving the state. We want to keep them in the state. Tier 2B, on the other hand, is more of it's a policy to keep the what we call non-competitive resources in the state, and those would be like small hydros that really don't have a market outside of New York, but yet they may need some economic help to keep them in operation. Again, we don't want to have any attrition of our existing baseline resources. So we believe that by having this separate tier to maintain those resources will help them stay in operation and will help keep those resources in New York State. And then the last tier, of course, Peter mentioned, is maintaining our existing nuclear fleet, our upstate nuclear fleet. Again, there is some economic hardship going on with all generation facilities, clean energy generation facilities. So this is just another mechanism to keep those facilities from ceasing operation, and because if they do, that's going to cause some major backsliding in our clean energy goals. So again, just looking at what the white paper provides in terms of a overview and framework, staff is recommending that the commission do a rolling 3-year look at the trajectory to 2030 based on our market experience. So it's staff's intention that we would lay out a schedule of annual targets at least through the first 2 triennial periods, so through 2023. And then after the triennial reviews, we would make adjustments accordingly. The reason being is that, you know, as we try to anticipate how much renewable energy we're going to be able to obtain, we're going to have to do a corrective course if we're either over or under our initial trajectory. So by doing that, we're going to be able to try to stay on course to get to that final 2030 number, but also make market corrections along the way. So the white paper lays out a initial trajectory through 2020 for Tier 1. Some of the recommendations staff is making is that Tier 1 be new renewables, obviously, that any new renewables be operational after January 1, 2015. And this really does build on the RPS program that ran from 2004 to 2015, where we had these main tier procurements. The Tier 1 renewables is really building on that legacy. The one difference is that we would be, we're recommending that eligibility for out-of-state resources. So it just wouldn't be New York-based resources. We would be seeking to get resources delivered from adjacent areas. The Tier 2A and 2B, again, existing renewables. I talked a little bit about this before. They're existing and operational. And again, this is to keep those existing facilities in operation. Tier 3, you can see where we have some gigawatt-hour targets here, and again, avoiding backsliding on emissions. We want to point out that this is a separate mandate than the 50 by 30. The 50 by 30 is renewable energy, and then the Tier 3 is a separate tier in support of the nuclear facilities. So with the nuclear facilities, a zero emission credit, or a ZEC, would be produced. And the way that the ZECs are going to be, let me say, addressed is a little different than the renewable or the REC portion. I'm actually going to turn it over to Jeff just to mention how the ZECs would be treated and determined in terms of each of the nuclear facilities that would be eligible for them.
Sure. So instead of a market type approach, which we've had for renewables, given the limited number of sellers of ZECs, essentially you're going to have nuclear plants, presumably in New York. You have market power issues. So we won't really be able to use an auction process in order to determine what's a reasonable level of compensation. So it's going to have to be administratively determined using the costs and the revenues of the plants themselves. That will require the plants that want to be able to sell ZECs to provide us with their cost information. That'll probably will involve some confidentiality. Then we will also be looking at revenue forecasts to see how much difference there is between cost and revenue. That delta is how the ZEC ACP would be calculated. Now, it's possible that, depending on how this is set up, that load-serving entities could enter into agreements for a price different than that ACP calculation, maybe a bundled product. That's, you know, one thing to be determined, but that's how we see the ACP being set.
Good, thank you, Jeff. So some other recommendations in the white paper, as Jeff mentioned, we'd have, because this is going to be an enforceable mandate on the load-serving entities, for those that do not meet their annual obligation, there will be an alternative compliance mechanism. Staff is recommending that the Commission set that ACP on a I'm not sure if it was an annual basis, but we would recommend that the Commission, once it is set, that it be reviewed annually, but to give some longer-term certainty, it could be every 3 years that it would be set with an annual review to make sure we don't have to make some course corrections. So long-term procurements, this was an issue that was teed up in the white paper. For those of you that are familiar with the main tier of the RPS program, NYSERDA put out annual solicitations for the renewable attributes for meeting the RPS obligation. The white paper tees up that NYSERDA could be the administrator of these long-term procurements. The paper also lays out a scenario where the electric distribution companies, the utilities, could also be the third-party administrator of these procurements. There's also a urging of parties to think of innovative solutions for long-term contracting to get renewable energy built in the state. Plants are going to need some long-term certainty, are going to need a long-term contract. There are, several ways that could be initiated, not only through long-term procurements of, bidding, but also through power purchase agreements. We've got, a good explanation in there why we think PPAs could serve as a very useful mechanism for getting plants built in the state. There's a discussion on utility ownership and where there may be instances where utility ownership could make sense. This is also teed up in the Rev Track 1 order. But really, we're looking for innovative market solutions to get renewable resources built in the state. So that's what's primarily teed up in the paper. Again, just looking at some of the other cost containment measures, the triennial review to make some, target adjustments if necessary. There's a recommendation for banking and borrowing of RECs. So that would hopefully, help with some of the cost containment that could be of concern to ratepayers. The plan, the white paper also lays out that staff is anticipating an implementation plan that would come out after the Commission makes its initial decision on the CES. The white paper discusses what that implementation plan would address. I want to just note that the white paper, again, is really staff's proposal. The Commission, in its order on the CES, could determine that it's got enough information to make some of these decisions earlier, or it could defer some of it to a later implementation plan. So I just wanted to stress that what staff is proposing doesn't obviously necessarily mean that the Commission is going to adhere to all those recommendations. Just some additional programs that are complementary to the Clean Energy Standard. You'll see them listed here. They're all under the umbrella of the Clean Energy Fund, which is a $5 billion 10-year endeavor that is managed by NYSERDA. That is really a program that's going to help us achieve our overall clean energy standard target by investing in energy efficiency and other programs to get clean energy integrated into the state. So as Peter said, a lot of outreach and next steps. There are stakeholder comments that are coming in on the white paper. The reply comments are due May 13th. There's comments on the cost study coming in June, series of public statement hearings, as you heard about already. And in terms of staff deliberation, once we get all the comments in and we hear from the public during these public statement hearings, staff will be making its final recommendations to the Commission for consideration and hopefully having an instituting order on the clean energy standard by this summer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl Moss from NYSERDA to go over the cost study, which was filed on April 8th.
Great, thanks, Tina.
Right click.
Bear with us 1 second while we get the slide moving forward.
Right click.
There we go. Okay. So thanks again, Tina, and Peter also. So I will be walking us through the cost study. As Peter had previously mentioned, our Clean Energy Standard cost study complements and helps to move forward our Clean Energy Standard staff white paper. This study was issued by DPS again in April, but the effort was actually led by NYSERDA, working very closely with DPS staff. And we'd also like to acknowledge we had the help of several consulting firms led by Sustainable Energy Advantage, who we worked with in the past to help us characterize RPS and now CES cost estimates. So based on its title, you get a sense of what the objective of the study was. It is a cost study, so looking at the costs of our proposed CES, but more importantly, it examines the impact that key cost drivers can have on overall consumer bills. So really our objective is to assist the PSC as it looks to design and implement a cost-effective standard. Okay. So leading at the top with a summary of the high-level results, what we found through our cost study analysis is that even given this period of low electricity prices, where we're seeing historically low natural gas prices, we can meet our CES targets with less than a 1% impact on electricity bills. And to give you a sense of what that means, we've translated that into a typical residential customer, and that equates to less than $1 a month. When you roll up all those analysis, looking at our base case assumptions, and we did a number of different scenarios, but again, for our central or base case assumptions, we see that the public investment that would be required for the CES over the near-term study period is $1.3 billion. All those clean energy assets that we can bring on in that near-term period would generate emission-free electricity, which produces $3.1 billion of carbon benefits. So when you look at the difference between those, we recognize there's a net program impact that's a benefit to all of New York State of $1.8 billion. So drilling in a little bit more after those high-level findings, we want to take a look at some of the key variables that could be uncertain going to the future. And all these conclusions that I'll be summarizing today, and which you can read about in the full cost study, focus on our near-term analysis period, which, as Tina mentioned, goes through 2023. So that would be the first two triennial review periods. This, again, coincides with the periodic reviews and recognizes that our forecasts looking out to 2030 are highly uncertain. And so we want to focus attention on the numbers and the metrics that we have higher certainty about. We do include analysis going out to 2030. I do have a graph that summarizes some of those results later in these slides. and that's to inform both our PSC and also stakeholders at large over what the magnitude of the impacts could be. But again, we emphasize that the near term out to 2023 is much more certain, and that was the focus of our summary metrics. So I mentioned at the outset that we're not just interested in absolute cost numbers, in this case a net benefit. We also want to examine key drivers to help inform cost-effective evolution of our CES. And so what that means is we look at a number of those drivers from different vantage points. The first one being how we procure our RECs. And we looked at both a REC plus energy, which is sometimes called the power purchase agreement. So that would be the renewable energy credit or attribute plus the actual energy that gets put into the market, versus a REC-only model. So in that case, the entity who was procuring the attribute would focus purely on the REC. Other factors that we've looked at that are key drivers are energy prices, so this is driven largely by natural gas price forecasts. Looking at interest rates, we've also looked at technology costs. Given this is a long study period and we have technologies that will be changing quickly over time, we've done sensitivities around those costs. We've also looked at energy use. So clearly, as load goes down or up, it will require more or less energy to come from the CES. And then finally, a very critical component is our federal tax credit, and that the federal government currently provides substantial resources to renewable energy systems, which helps to reduce the cost to us. Okay, continued with our key findings. What we have found is that the CES as proposed balances cost impact and results in significant net benefits to all New Yorkers, as I mentioned, are $1.8 billion. The procurement structure, so this REC plus energy versus REC, and the total energy used, so the amount of load that we realize in the out years, significantly impact costs and are factors that New York can influence, and that's critical. There are, in many cases, there are factors where New York may have little influence over them, such as natural gas prices in the region. But how we go about procuring our attributes, or attributes plus energy, and the aggressive programs that we put in place to try to reduce load will have significant impacts on the overall cost. As I've mentioned previously, energy prices are highly uncertain and are also an important driver, and I have a graph that later on that shows you a little bit of what those impacts might be. And we also found that for the near-term interest rates and technology costs are variable, but they actually have a relatively small near-term impact. You can do it with the keyboard, can't you?
Yeah. I think you just got it, did you?
Okay. You're on the right line.
33. Carl.
Okay, sorry. We're lining up our slides. Here we go. So final slide within our key findings. Part of what we've learned by the fact that our technology's cost sensitivity doesn't have a significant impact on costs is that it shows that there are other technologies in the wing. So as one technology gets more expensive, there are others that are available. So there are trade-offs between onshore and offshore wind, trade-offs between solar and wind. And what this shows is that a technology-neutral approach, which is how we've proposed to structure our CES, is an appropriate design choice. It allows us to have a more robust policy mechanism. Finally, we've discovered, which reinforces what we thought, but we've been able to quantify it, our current federal tax credits significantly reduce the costs to New York, an important driver. So in summary of our key findings, we found that the combination of low energy prices, low interest rates, and available tax credits presents a favorable environment for near-term investment into renewables. And just to signify that in a final graph, what we have here is a view on the wholesale spend in New York. And this shows the historic and the forecasted wholesale spend The purple line, which starts off on the left when it's solid, is how much we've spent in New York. And what you can see there is, looking back in time, we've spent over $10 billion on our wholesale energy. In recent years, as natural gas prices have come down, so has that required overall spend. You will see that there's some volatility. In examples, in 2014, during the polar vortex, we saw a spike in prices and therefore a spike in spend. The dashed purple lines going to the right show you different forecasted energy prices. So that central line with the smallest dashes and the red line above it is our central case, our base case. And the red line shows you what the wholesale spend would be with the addition of the CES. It gives you a sense of the magnitude. When, again, translated into wholesale price impacts, that's less than a 1% wholesale price, retail price impact, and this gives you a sense of what the wholesale prices are. What we also show on this graph is what happens if natural gas prices are higher or lower. So that top dashed purple line shows you what our wholesale spend would need to be under a higher natural gas future. And as you might expect, as wholesale prices go up, there's more revenue for the renewable energy systems, and therefore our spend can go down. Therefore, there's a very small amount of space between the line above that top purple line and the purple line itself. What we find is that under higher natural gas prices, many of the future renewable energy technologies will be cost effective just based on market revenues, and therefore our spend will be very small. So what do we see in the converse case? So if natural gas prices go down, we'll see lower wholesale prices, and that's what that bottom dashed line shows. And as you would expect, the blue line above it shows that there's a larger gap between what the total spend would be with the CES versus wholesale spend without. But the good news is that under a low gas price forecast, we all benefit because we're paying lower wholesale prices. And even with our CES higher premium, that future is still less expensive from a wholesale spend than our base case. So in summary, while the CES program costs would be higher under a lower energy price, which is that lower dashed line, this would be outweighed by customer savings on their overall energy bills due to lower energy prices. And that concludes our discussion of the cost study. And I think at this point I can turn it back over to Peter, and I can handle questions and comments.
Great. Thanks, Carl and Tina and Jeff for chiming in. We hope that was informative for you, and we answered a lot of your burning questions. But in the event that we didn't, you can use your chat function and submit those now. And we can take those in the order that they come. So looks like we only have one on deck right now, and the question is large-scale hydro either existing or new from an adjacent area with proof of delivery eligible under so I guess I would turn that over to
Tina. So large-scale hydro, we, in the white paper, teed up an appendix that had eligible technologies. In the RPS, we had limited hydro to 30 megawatts run-of-river. In the white paper, we took off that 30 megawatt criteria. So the short answer is yes, we would expect large-scale hydro to make up part of our renewable energy requirements. And the one thing to just note that in the white paper, in Appendix C, the criteria is no new storage impoundments, and that eligibility for new large-scale or existing large-scale hydro would be limited to the incremental production associated with that upgrade. So there's not a size limit.
And whether it's Tier 1 or 2A would be just depend on the date that was constructed.
Right, correct.
Okay, are there any other questions out there? Not seeing any, so I would just remind folks that we have our technical conference tomorrow on the cost study. That'll be here in Albany, Agency Building 3, and the boardroom, which is on the 19th floor. And then starting next week on May 10th, we'll have our first of several public statement hearings. So if you do have questions, those will be good opportunities to bring those up, and certainly staff can be available to answer questions as they come up, but we really appreciate everybody's attention and interest in these important issues, and look forward to engaging with you all moving forward. So thanks for your attention, and hope you have a great day.
Recording started.